Good day and welcome to the Strong Ambition Podcast. I am your host, Rylan Qualley. I'm here to dive into what makes people ambitious and live a more ambitious life, especially in the realms of nutrition, exercise, or mindset. And today I have a guest that will speak to the nutrition and mindset piece, more specifically, emotional eating. And emotional eating is something I'm all too familiar with. So Alicia Castaneda was someone who I was introduced to through my business coach, and she came on and did a little presentation for my clients, and this is over a month ago, and truly blew me away how much she really understand the layers that go into our decisions, especially around food. And it made me start to really understand my food even more. I was already starting to try to respect this, but she opened the light and gave some great understanding and rubrics around food. And so today we dive even more into it. We dive into her story. We dive into where she came from. We discuss some of the fundamentals of emotional eating from her perspective and how she works with her clients. We talk about understanding what satiety really is. We talk about challenges of environments, how you handle the holidays. Overall, just an amazing lesson from her. So I think if you have any concerns around emotional eating, this is a podcast for you. So without further ado, here is Alicia. Good day, Alicia. How are you doing today?
Doing pretty well, thank you. How are you?
Great. I'm pretty swell myself. Thank you. I always love the fall weather. It's a lot calmer, and I sleep better at nights. It's not so warm here, right? So that's my thing. So I always give a rough introduction in the intro, but what I really like to hear is a little bit from just the client themselves, to introduce themselves, to hear their story. So why don't you introduce yourself to the audience and tell us about yourself and how you grew up?
Sure. So that's a big question. My name is Alicia Castaneda. I work now as a mindset coach, primarily in the field of nutrition. So I help people with their food relationships, their body image, and their self worth, which has a surprisingly strong tie to both nutrition and fitness. And you asked how I grew up. I could give you a whole long life story. I would say probably, well, I grew up in the suburbs of Long Island, New York, currently living in BC, Canada. But I think a large part of my story that pertains to where I'm at now and what I'm doing with my life is the fact that I struggled with my mental health from the time that I was a kid. So from around 7 or 8 years old, I started to struggle with depression, which was just got increasingly worse as I got older. I struggled with anxiety and panic attacks and an eating disorder. And the reason that I'm in the field of mindset and mindfulness right now is because of how I was able to completely turn my life around just using the power of my thoughts. And of course there was much more to it, but I would say, in terms of my story, that was one of the biggest assets for me.
Yeah, that's a really cool one. So I do love hearing this part. So we can dive into this because especially as a new guest, I want to hear your backstory because I believe as a strong ambition podcast, I believe that people discover little influences along the way, and it's a lot of their struggles that leads them into becoming very motivated and into what you're doing. It was your struggles that yield the character that you are. So why don't you tell us a little bit about some of these big moments that you were growing up that changed your perception?
What changed my perception really wasn't anything that happened until I was much older. So when I was a kid, and when I was a teenager and through my 20s, I was very much stuck in this victim mode where I thought, the more that I found out about depression, the more I thought, well, it's just my brain chemistry. I'm broken. There's nothing I can do about it. I'm just going to live with this for the rest of my life. And when I get depressed, I'm depressed, and there's nothing I can do about it. And it wasn't even until I was about 20 that I discovered that how had been feeling up to that point wasn't normal. I thought just everybody felt sad all the time because that's how I felt. And so it wasn't until I was diagnosed with depression when I was around 20 that I realized that that was abnormal. And I was having panic attacks and I didn't know what they were. I'd never heard of it before. But how things kind of came to turn around was when I discovered that the way that you think can actually influence your brain chemistry, can actually influence your emotions, the way that you feel. And so using that information, and I'll really simplify it here, but using that information, I was able to kind of claw my way out of depression. And then I found out that using your mindset, you can safeguard yourself against some of these things. And I was able to completely turn that around. I haven't had a panic attack in years. I haven't been depressed in years. And anytime that I feel myself slipping now, I can pull myself back out. And that was just through this discovery. I do a lot of reading. I've been sort of addicted to self-help books since I think I picked the first one up when I was maybe around 18. And then I was like, oh, I'm going to find out as much as I possibly can. So I'm a really avid reader. And that was where I discovered how much control we really have over how we think, and thus how we feel and how we act.
Yeah, I think I love hearing that. And I find it so interesting when people talk about self-help books and it can have a negative connotation to it, or almost like it's corny, or, maybe they're not helpful. But, it's people who don't read them that have that perception of them, And so there's a lot of things to learn that we just can't learn in school. So self-help books are there for a reason. It's through other people's wisdom that we have a better shot. Now, I just want to come back a little bit to, understanding, how you were struggling with this and in that clawing. I loved how you described that, because that's a very potent and powerful way to describe this. So you're struggling throughout your teens and into your early 20s. Was your relationship with food really poor at this time? Were you doing any sports? Did that have any negative connotations with exercise? And then what was kind of the start of the revolution for you?
So everything started to kind of compound on itself over time. So the depression that I felt in my teens got worse as I was in my 20s. Anxiety started out as kind of general anxiety and then erupted into panic attacks. And then with my eating disorder, I would say I started my unhealthy relationship with food developed when I was around the time I was 13 or 14, which was when I started my first diet. I started replacing my lunches with Slim Fast shakes. And that began this whole cycle of restriction. And I would restrict food as much as I could. And then I would just eat I would just eat multiple meals. And that eventually turned into further restriction. And I would, you asked about exercise. I would just run for miles and try to burn as much of the food off as I could. And then that would spike my hunger and I would just eat like an entire box of spaghetti. So I just started eating more and more, and I started restricting more and more. And then it just turned into full-on bulimia, which I didn't even realize until much later, that when I started to think back about those patterns, and I was like, oh no, I was full-on binging. I was restricting food. I was exercising it off. I was using laxatives, and then I was throwing up. And and then all of that happened over the period of about 15 years or so, that it really came to a head. And then in terms of, in terms of being able to shift out of it, I had started working with a coach, with an online fitness coach, when I was 26, and I'm 34 now for context, or I'll be 34 tomorrow. So I started working with this online fitness coach. He taught me about the basics of nutrition. He taught me about macros. We started counting macros, and I started to lose weight, and I felt really successful in it, but it didn't really solve my underlying food issues. So I was successful for a short time, and then I started binging and purging again. So what really changed for me it was again in another book, was when I read that binging is just a habit. And I read that, and it just struck me to the point where I didn't even finish the rest of the book. It was about halfway through. Binging is just a habit. And I realized, from having read so many self-help and personal development books, oh, I know what a habit is. I know how habits are formed, and I know that I can change this. And that was when I realized that I was really in control of it, or that I could learn how to be. So yeah, it was I have been in therapy before. I'm a very big advocate for therapy, coaching, things like that, having someone on your side and then having someone to kind of explain what's going on in your own head, and this connection between your thoughts and your behaviors. So like I said, I'm a huge advocate of that. But also for me, the place where everything started was in these different books.
It's really funny when you have those moments, the aha moment, the light bulb moments, and there's many of them. And when you just hear a certain phrasing, and like you said, there was probably a lot more in that book. And this is something I've always believed is the right words with the right ears at the right time changes lives. And it's not even always the intention of that one statement. You might have heard it 100 other times, but there's the right reception in the right time is what you need sometimes. And I've heard a lot of the same things, and then all of a sudden, like, oh, that's right, they were talking about that, and I was ignoring it. And so that's a real powerful moment. Those are real big perception moments, and I think that's incredible. And just knowing that you came from the bulimia, I think what people don't realize about bulimia is how common it is, and just like how people who look inherently healthy actually have it. And it's all the way from it's basically compensatory methods, right? So it could be through laxatives, thrown up, or exercise itself. Like you binge and you just try to overcompensate. And it's just that natural inclination that we think of, this food is bad, I have to work it off. And that is so not the right behavior around food or reactions, right? So it's hard to train these ideas, but I really appreciate where you're getting into. And let's dive into this turning point of habit. So you're working with your therapist, or in this time, and you heard that word habit. So where the rabbit hole lead you into? How did it continue to evolve to improve these habits?
Yeah, so it's interesting that you say you had kind of broken it down into there's the binging and the purging, which, especially if it's something like exercise, can actually, like I said, it had would spike my hunger. And so what I had to do was actually break them apart, and I had to first work on not purging. And so I would continue binging, and I would sit with those feelings of regret, the feelings of guilt, the feelings of shame, and just work to stop purging. And then I was able to work on the binging. So scaling back the binging, it became kind of morphed into more emotional eating, and which is very, very similar. I see them as being on a spectrum, except that emotional eating is not such large quantities of food. And so I was able to just kind of scale everything back using, again, by breaking it apart. So I stopped purging. Then with the binging, I was able to shift. Instead of, eating until I felt sick, I would eat smaller quantities of food, but it was still more than I wanted to be eating. It was still overeating. And then to work on the emotional eating as kind of the last step.
Yeah, I like how you say you got to break it apart. And the way I started to look at it when I heard the whole idea of the binging and purging, I even just started to recognize that they're both binging. I'm binging on exercise, or I'm binging on food. And
Yeah.
the thing is you qualify the binging on exercise because it's a positive. And then what it even ends up doing is later on, it's like, well, I can just binge this off and exercise, this food binge, right? So it's just this extreme, it's the extreme yo-yo behavior, but it's one feeds into the other pretty naturally, right? You compensate as soon as you do one, the other is bound to happen, right? And I like how you said you took away one and it made you more responsible to the other. And that's what I find for myself is like, when I started to recognize, is like, hey, just you just don't let yourself do that much exercise. You're going to have to be responsible for what you eat. And that just makes more sense, right? And to improve that relationship with food. And that was some of the stuff when you had spoken with my clients. Like, I really love that discussion around emotional eating and getting to know it. So what were some real pivotal lessons for you when it came to the idea of emotional eating and connecting with that side of it?
Yeah, I didn't even realize again, so a lot of the learning that I did about my habits was just looking back and recognizing, because in the moment I didn't realize that anything was really tied to my emotions because I wasn't paying attention to them. And looking back, I'm able now to see just how much I was using it as a method of escape. So getting home from a long day of work, feeling like I wanted to push myself to do something, but then I didn't have the energy, and then I would feel guilty or I'd feel stressed out about how much I was working. And so I had all of these different stressors in my life. There was much more going on, but I had all these different stressors in my life that I was using food to escape, because as soon as I ate this food, I would start feeling better. I would start feeling, comforted. And so I would use this as a form of escape. And so it was learning about that connection between having these uncomfortable emotions, learning how to recognize them, and seeing how I was using the food to cope with them, because that's really what anyone who is an emotional eater is doing. They are experiencing these strong, uncomfortable emotions, and instead of coping with them, they use the food as an escape mechanism. So once I was able to see that, I was able to start learning how to, and this is the same exact thing that I now teach, learning how to sit with the emotions, learning how to transform the emotions, learning how to sit with cravings. So these are all things that can be practiced. And a lot of us aren't ever really taught how to feel our emotions. We immediately go into very, very often just wanting to escape them, wanting to get away from them, wanting to either smother them, whether that's with food or with alcohol or browsing the internet or porn or anything else. And so we will either smother them, or we'll try to ignore them, or we'll act out on them, which is most often used with anger. So we'll act on it rather than actually allowing ourselves to sit in it, to feel it, to observe what's happening. And so this is what I was learning and what I now teach in order to be able to cope with those emotions so that the eating habit wouldn't be triggered.
Yeah, I like how you went on a good description, and I don't think anyone thinks, or a few people are recognizing like, hey, your emotion comes up all the time. Like, this is what makes us so human. I appreciated this a while ago where I told people, I was like, you know what it was is I got into and I'm not proud of this to some degree. I got into a hockey fight, and I'm normally not a fighter. And I was a boxer. I always liked it in the ring, and so all I did was I said, "Yeah, my emotions got the best of me." And now I go, and he was like, "Whoa, that was enough." And the more I just said this, I was like a test. I was like, "Yeah, my emotions got the best of me." And it was just a recognition from every person that I talked to. Doesn't matter their preferences on combat or not. They were just like, yeah, emotions are a thing. And the problem with us as people is that we don't predict emotions. We're not aware, and we don't, like you had said, we don't reflect on them, and we don't predict them, but we're so aware that they exist. It's almost like not considering that gravity is going to be an issue eventually. And it's like, yeah, like it's always around, and you can't predict it super well, but you can learn from the past. So I love how you kind of dive into this, like sitting with these emotions. You even said sit with your emotion. Sit with cravings is a very powerful one. Know what it is, recognize what it is, and appreciating that sometimes it's just a feeling, and a feeling can kind of surpass. So I mean, for myself, that's where meditation was very helpful for me. And I found when I started to meditate was appreciation that thoughts are in and out. You don't always have to succumb to each and every thought. You can come back to your breath, come back to the present moment, and then those things can dissipate. So what are some, do you use meditation or do you have some other tactics? Is it kind of the practice you say of trying to be within the emotions? What kind of other tactics do you have for that?
Well, a lot of it is related to meditation. So when people hear the word meditation, oftentimes they think about a formal sitting meditation where you're sitting like on a cushion, you have your legs crossed, you have your eyes closed, everything is quiet and still, and you're stilling your mind. But the way that I think, and that can be really helpful because it helps us to practice quieting our minds. It helps us to practice getting focused on what's happening internally, or even, this kind of meditation doesn't have to be done quietly. It doesn't have to be done with your eyes closed. You can be there just observing what's going on. And so the foundation of everything that I teach, we start with mindfulness, which is, rather than trying to clear your mind, is just paying attention. So it's observing what's happening internally and externally. So what are your external triggers? What's going on in your environment, but also what's happening internally? What emotions are you feeling, and what do they feel like to you? And we use this to start observing what our emotional triggers are and what we're feeling, so that we know how to cope with and process those emotions. But we also use it for things like mindful eating, where we start learning to pay attention to our hunger signals, which a lot of people end up ignoring as well. I work with a lot of chronic diet. I say chronic dieters because, people that have been dieting their whole lives, and they get used to trying to ignore their hunger signals, and they get used to, they get used to not paying attention sometimes because they're using these external cues to tell them how much or what to eat, from a meal plan to counting macros to something else is telling them how much to eat as opposed to their body. And so they get used to ignoring that. And so what I do for myself and for the people that I work with is learning how to bring back this quality of attention, this practice of observing mindfulness.
Yeah, I like that. And I like how you just dumb it down to it doesn't have to be folding your legs and sitting there and even doing a mantra as the traditional old school thought of what a meditation is. Paying attention. It's legitimately paying attention to you as a person. There's a really interesting show on Netflix. It's called The Midnight Gospel, I think. And
I've seen a few episodes.
Yeah, in the first one I watched, there was just one statement, and I've heard it before, but the way they put it was really well, is that as a conscious being, we are both the thing that is experiencing it and viewing the experience. And that second part is something that people take for granted, and I always have for years until meditation. View your experience, recognize your experience. And that's like, it's a little bit of 2 degrees of separation there, right? Where you can experience it, but then there's information there from viewing the experience, because then you can learn from it. And that's a very powerful thing. Like you say, pay attention to these things, pay attention to cues. The other major thing I love that you went over was the hunger cue thing, because right away this resonated with me. And I remember having a discussion with my friend who I always talk about dieting with, and then I was literally amplifying that, yeah, you got to lean into that hunger sometimes. It was like a gratifying thing in the realm of bodybuilding and cutting, that you just, oh, I'm on the right track because I'm starving. Mm-hmm. And that's where like the prep goes. And that's cutting, that's bodybuilding, that's not life, And so There's a problem with this chronic dieting where you're like, okay, I'm used to that feeling. I get hungry. That's okay. But appetite is a bit different. It's a bit different if we're talking about craving because you see sweets, or if you're doing the emotional eating, and it's a bit different to recognize those. And if you don't try to pay attention to the difference of the two, they all seem the same. And then the odds are you're probably going to ignore the hunger when it could have been a good meal. You could have had a whole food meal. And then you're going to lean into that really what is your appetite when you see the sweets, because you've been putting off that hunger for so long. And I can still remember this one day. This was back when I first really got into boxing, and weight cutting was an issue. I just had to be in a weight. And I watched myself. You talk about watching yourself. Watch myself start with 1 bowl, and it led into 4 bowls in a row, because I thought when the first bowl hit, I was like, well, it's within my calories. I can have 1. And then all of a sudden I was on autopilot and I couldn't stop. Mm-hmm. And there were so many times where I'd watch myself binge. I'm like, why am I not stopping? And I just couldn't. Like, it was like a trance. It was like this, you're just caught into this loop of, I'm not full enough, And so it's really fascinating to start to peel back that question. And so when you're dealing with, someone's dealing with emotional eating, let's say, they got these stressors. So where do you kind of develop, and I know you have your model, and you can go in your model if you want, but what are some like key, like real tips that you give people to recognize it, how to handle the stresses, like how to handle that stressful life, and maybe not lean into that food as like quite as quickly and stuff like that for emotional eating?
Well, going back to something that you just mentioned was the difference between bodybuilding or cutting for a weight related competition like boxing. There's a huge difference between that and between non-athletes who are dieting. So as a bodybuilder, and I'll just use that as an example because I've done that before as well. I've done several competitions, is when you have a date, when that dieting is going to be over. And so it allows you to know, it gives you that really that kind of psychological relief that I only have to do this for a certain period of time. I only have a few more weeks left, or I only have a few more days left. And that allows you to, again, to really lean into this intense hunger. Whereas if you don't have an end date, it's much more uncomfortable. It's much harder to keep that up, to just think that, am I just going to be uncomfortable forever? Am I just going to continue getting hungry and hungrier? And I've experienced this both as a client and as a coach. And so I do have some, well, I call my clients students, but I do have some students who are actively working to lose weight. I do have some that are tracking. And sometimes what we'll do is I'll say, these are our guidelines, but if you start feeling uncomfortably hungry, we monitor their hunger signals as well, because we might actually need to bump that food up if they're getting too uncomfortable. And this is something that, again, I've experienced as on the client side, which is I can start out, when I start out a new cutting phase, I can go for a couple weeks just on that excitement of doing something new. And then if I'm in too deep of a deficit, the hunger would just build and build and build until I feel like I'm going to crack. And that's when I knew to reach out to my coach and say, hey, I'm actually starving and I can't keep this up. But a lot of our clients that we work with, they don't know. They just assume this is what my coach told me to do and I have to do it. I have to just muscle through. They don't know to say, or many of them don't know to say, hey, this is a little bit too much. We need to make an adjustment. So I wanted to just touch on that first. And then, so your question with emotional eating was what do we do to kind of work with some of those emotions?
Yeah, like just it could be kind of big picture approach stuff. Like I hear quite often where people are like, yeah, if I get stressed, or this person in my family comes around, cause more stress, and those are some hard triggers, right? Is when it's environmental.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So one thing you touched on before was this idea of this cravings, and when we have a craving, we can just sit with it, and it has a finite lifespan, which is something that a lot of people don't expect, because most of the time we have a craving, we'll sit with it, it gets worse, and then we cave, because we feel like if we don't get rid of it, it's going to be there forever and it's just going to keep getting worse. But if we actually stick it out, the average lifespan of a craving is only about 20 minutes. And so I would encourage anyone who's listening to actually try this out, to see what happens the next time that you experience a craving and you decide that you're going to sit with it and just observe what happens. Just see what happens over the first 5 minutes. Does it get worse? Are you fixated on it? Are you ruminating on it? Does it lessen? So what happens to it over the next 5 minutes? And just keep checking in with yourself and see, well, how long does it take for that craving to go away? And maybe it takes 25 or 30 minutes, and just see actually what happens. Allow yourself to do this as an experiment to see what it is like. And once we've done that once, then we see, oh, I can do that again. And we can start building up that ability, that muscle to sit with our cravings. So when it comes to emotions, that's a little bit different. So again, the primary thing that we start with is this foundation of mindfulness, which is being able to observe when our emotions come up, to try to put a label on them, to try to name the emotion as specifically as we can. So rather than to say, I'm mad, would be to say, I'm frustrated, or I'm disappointed, or I'm irritated. So we try to get as specific as possible. We also look at, what are the triggers for this? And rather than blaming our outside circumstances, whether that is something that happened or someone else, rather than saying like, he made me feel or she made me feel, we start to take responsibility for our emotions and to say, this is something that happened. He said X. And what did you think in reaction to that? So we can see that it's not what someone said, but it's our own thoughts, how we're interpreting that creates the emotion for ourselves. So the way that we know that we're creating this for ourselves is you and I could be sitting here and someone could walk up to us. Well, imagine that we're sitting together in person. Someone walks up to us and they start insulting us. And let's say you just laugh and you kind of brush it off and you're like, that person's insane. And I start getting really offended and I'm like, what the F is like, are they going on about? And I start, getting into an argument with them. So they said the exact same thing to both of us. But the fact that you and I are having different emotional reactions tells us that it's something that's happening in our own brains. So your thoughts are like, this person's crazy, I'm just going to ignore them, and I'm actually laughing about the situation. And in my head, I'm like deeply offended and I'm wanting to right this wrong. I'm getting angry. And that had nothing to do, well, so I won't say it had nothing to do. But each of us have this external trigger, but we're reacting very differently. And so we can use that when we're in a situation. So like we have, holidays coming up and we're going to be around, or maybe around potentially triggering family members, things like that. I know you mentioned that as an example. And we can start to recognize, oh, this person's just saying something. So to use that process of observation that you mentioned, just to observe when this person says X, then it gets my blood boiling. Oh, I'm having this reaction. Why am I having this reaction? What am I thinking? Well, oftentimes when we get angry, it's because we perceive some sort of unfairness and that we feel like we need to correct. And so we can just observe that in ourselves and we can see. So one of the most important lessons that I teach is that emotions are just messengers. And so we want to see, what is the message that this emotion has for us? If we're feeling angry, what are we feeling angry about? What does that anger want us to do? Well, it wants us to correct some sort of perceived unfairness. And then we can look at that and say, well, do we have to? What is going to be the outcome for that, for me, for someone else? And we can start just observing our behavior and seeing, what message does this emotion have for me? What is it motivating me to do? What is it compelling me to do? And do I actually want to take that action? Is that going to be the best course of action for me? Because even though our emotions are giving us a message, we don't always have to act on it.
I love that description of it being messengers, and it's information, but it's not everything. It's not the whole picture. And I even want to come back to the thing about appetite, because it's exactly what I experienced when I first was using meditation, and I kind of came up with this idea of willpower points. And it was so funny you said 20 minutes, because that's exactly what I experienced. Was I would see, especially living with roommates who had terrible diets, so they had all the good food. And I'm a great roommate except for food. If you have food that I like and it's around, I'm probably going to eat it. But I looked at this food the one day, and it was like this craving. It was almost in my stomach because it feels physical, right? And then I'm like, wait a minute, that's just a thought. push it aside. And my friend who had introduced me to meditation said, push it aside. You can just push it aside. And I pushed it aside, and it was legit. 20 minutes later, I have felt nothing. And so I started to kind of tailor these as being willpower points. And I encourage people to recognize it, because when you're trying to create more control around these foods, and it's not that you can't have them, it's just control. And so what I started doing was, like, we get credit for the reps we do in a gym. There's a weight to it and the resistance. It's legit resistance. This is mental resistance. So my thing is, make sure you track what you're not doing in a positive way, because if you had all these resistant points and you didn't recognize it, that's probably not as gratifying. And so I start, and it's just a simple practice. People don't have to do it every day and all the time, but it's a starting point where I say, keep it simple. Rate that food on a temptation scale 1 to 5. And, you might be a 3 or a 4. And if I see cookies and they're fresh baked, it's a 5 for me. And so at the end of the day, you're like, oh man, I had like a 24-point day. That's a good day. That's doing some work. And so I really love how you quantify it that way. You call it a muscle, and that's what people have to recognize. And just to come back to the emotion side of things, of, recognizing it's not just what's being happened to you, it's just what's happening, right? And it's how you reflect on it. And the more we can become, it goes back to that consciousness of, like, recognizing how you don't have to interpret everything the same way. And quite often, as you had given that example, I try not to let myself get angry at things that make people angry, because that's what can happen, is I cannot be the person I want to be. Most of the time, we don't end up being the person we want to be. Now, anger has a purpose sometimes, but quite often it can cloud what's really there. And just the idea of this practice, and you had used this word earlier, and I think it's very important for all the listeners to appreciate the way you described it, clawing your way back. All of these are big picture concepts, and this is really fucking hard, right? Like someone pisses you off, stay in that for a minute. It's like, that's going to be hard, right? And so that's why, individuals like yourself being a coach for these forms of coaching are so important and so valuable, because I've done it with some of my clients recently, and they had some stressful events and stuff like that. And I just asked them to really reflect on, the situation. You can't control that person. That is a person that you will not control. And the person that they are is not something you can control. And the person that they are probably isn't a great person. And if they're doing this stuff to you, who do you want to be in this moment, right? Do you want to reflect that? And so it was really interesting how we were able to control their stress, basically. It's going to be a stressful event, but how you reflect on it is really what it's doing to you. And again, it's a practice. So I think that's some really good advice. When it comes to aside from that, I know you've spoke a little bit before, one of the previews you had mentioned about you try to work on, satiety, because that's a very important thing, right? Because if people don't have the right food, the less beneficial food or the sweet foods are going to seem that much more, potent, and so how do you kind of train satiety with your clients?
So I break it down into physical satiety and mental satiety, because most of the time nutrition coaches are only focused on the physical satiety. And so they're encouraging their clients to eat more whole foods, eat more veggies, lean protein, things like that, because we want to keep ourselves physically satiated. And I think it's just as important for us to be mentally satiated. So what I mean by that is, if you can imagine, or if you have ever gotten to the end of a meal and then you start looking around, or you start thinking, what else can I have? And it happens even more. It's even more common when we start dieting. We start thinking, that was really good, but I want more. I'm not done. And then maybe we go into the cabinets and we start looking for something else, or we open the fridge and we're kind of looking around for what else can we eat? So what we want to do is we want to be able to get to the end of that meal and to feel like that was enough. Physically, that was enough. And mentally, that was enough. I don't need to look for anything else. So the physical satiety, I actually don't focus on as much with most people, because we already know what to eat. one thing that I do though is I change the language a little bit. So instead of calling things like healthy foods or junk foods, we break it down into fundamental foods, which are those like mostly whole foods, lean proteins, things like that, and fun foods. And so fundamental foods are what you want the majority of your diet to be made up of. And then the fun foods are the ones that don't provide a lot of quality nutrition, but we still really enjoy them. They're fun. And so we want to, again, have the majority of our diet be made up of those fundamental foods. Whatever someone decides to eat inside of that breakdown is up to them. But this also, part of this is to, how to put it, so that we're not demonizing certain foods and we're recognizing that, oh, fun foods can be an important part of my diet as a whole. In terms of mental satiety, the way that we do this is in two ways. One is to actually build meals that we enjoy. So one thing that I stress with a lot of people is don't eat foods you don't like. And so many people forget that we can do this, that we don't have to force ourselves to eat like low fat cheese if we think it's gross. Some people like it, for a lot of people. We don't have to eat cottage cheese to get more protein in if we don't like it, or egg whites. I'm just trying to think of like things that typically will turn people off.
Chicken, rice, and broccoli.
Yeah, if you don't like that, there are so many other different ways to get in your protein, to get in your carbs, to get in your veggies. And so building meals that we actually will enjoy eating. And then the second component is to eat more mindfully, because when we eat more mindfully, when we pay attention to our foods, we are actually noticing, well, we're savoring the food more, but we're actually, by increasing that quality of attention, we are actually noticing how full we are getting. So oftentimes with things like emotional eating, but with other forms of mindless eating too, we're just eating, and then before we know it, we get to the end of the plate and it's like, oh, I didn't even really notice. And we're not giving ourselves that time to check in with our hunger signals and see, am I full? Do I need something more? Was I full about 10 bites ago and I just kept going? And so one thing that I actually am really excited to be able to talk about today, because this is a study that I just found last week. So it was after the last time that we talked. But what this study showed is, so experimenters gave people two different shakes to drink. And one shake was labeled as this like dessert indulgent sugar bomb, basically. So you're thinking high calorie. And then the other one was labeled as a low cal healthy shake. So what they discovered was that with the higher calorie dessert like indulgent shake, that people's levels of ghrelin were actually lower. So for people who are listening, ghrelin is a hormone that tells you when you're hungry. So the more ghrelin you have, the more ghrelin is released, the hungrier you will feel. And so as you eat a meal, your ghrelin level will get lower. So as you get fuller, your ghrelin level is lower. So when they were eating that indulgent shake, their ghrelin levels were lower. When they were having the low cal, the diet shake, their ghrelin levels remained higher. But they had only put these different labels on the shakes. They were the exact same shake with the exact same number of calories. But it was the way that people thought about the shake. When they thought it had more calories, they felt fuller faster. When they thought it had fewer calories, they didn't feel as full. And I think that this is such a beautiful demonstration of how much our thinking and our attention to our food can actually change what's happening in our bodies and our experience with that food. So yeah, that's how so just to kind of recap, the way that I teach mental satiety is by paying attention to our food and making sure that it is food that we enjoy, so that we don't get to the end and we're like, I didn't enjoy that meal. Now I want something that I will enjoy.
Yeah, I all that was great, especially when you kind of look at the word mental satiety was very powerful for me when we spoke last, and I'm still to this day working on this for myself. Because I came from boxing and then bodybuilding, and so all these are just literally giving you the rubric of a yo-yo diet. And so what I needed was I wanted more lifestyle. And when you spoke about that, I even asked myself more often, is like, am I eating past satiety? And I was. And so I started to ask myself more often at the end of a meal, could I leave this? Yeah, I think I'm good. Even if like mentally I know where the calories are, it's like, well, but I'm full. So let's walk away.
Mhm.
And it's been really pivotal because I think when you come from the dieting experience, you have no recognition of satiety. You are either starving or stuffing, and anything in between doesn't make sense. And so, if you don't practice, like, to me, it's like, hey, practice what the right amount is. Do you have any idea? No, you really don't. And I think people who don't, and this is my theory, when I look at the metabolisms that people don't have a hard time with their weight, mainly because they recognize satiety pretty intuitively and they just haven't been as concerned about it. And so when you've developed this horrible relationship with satiety, because the true satiety you don't really look for, and it's more mental these days than anything because of the foods, right? And like how you described it, you're looking for something. And we even get used to, like, desserts were really bad for this. It's a habit of, okay, I'm finished my wine. Well, where's the sweetness? And we always have room for sweetness for some reason, right? But I really love how you teach those fundamental practices. I think that's what makes such a difference. And like you say, fun foods, you don't demonize food. You don't got to call them a cheat food. There's no rules to this game, right? There's success and there's people trying to get success. Like, you don't got to create rules. And I think cheat makes it a negative connotation. And so that's why I call them treats, for the exact same reason that you do. It's like, hey, this food is good for enjoyment. I'm not a bad person if I want to watch TV. That doesn't help my job. No, I'm sitting around and doing nothing, but I enjoy it. So that's an important part of life. It's an important part of your food culture, right? And that's a whole nother rabbit hole, food culture. Like, we got Thanksgiving and Christmas and all that stuff. It's like, what, are you going to make sure you're staying on your diet then? It's like, I think it's pretty important that you don't feel that way when you're in, you can actually enjoy this food and know the right amount. I love all this stuff. It's very powerful because I think this is where so many people miss it. I think the practice and the coaching and the industry that you're in is what's missing. It's a real missing piece in this whole puzzle, is when people are looking at nutrition and dieting, because we're not looking enough of us as an individual and what food means to us, rather than this is the food and this is what you should eat. Because the shoulds doesn't matter if you can't. And so to try to develop that relationship with food is super important, because it's one thing I always tell people, I could write you a list to be in the gym and we could rely on that. You'll probably get it done because you're going to confine that to an hour, 45 minutes of your day. And, it doesn't have to be super cultural, environmental, and all that stuff. It's not going to disrupt your emotional life. But food is morning, noon, and night. It's with your family. It's by yourself. It's so intimate. There's no way that we're going to make this generalized, right? It has to be very customized, and you need to understand it. And I don't think you can really get long-term success unless you ask yourself those questions. So I really love that. And I'm curious, do you have, as the holiday season isn't too far from us, and I know you, being an American, you might even think that Thanksgiving still hasn't happened yet.
I get two Thanksgivings
You
now.
you do too. Okay, you double down. Do you have any, like, extra advice for clients around those holiday events?
The way that I'm working with people right now is to really dive into their identity and how they want to feel in those days, not only that day, but also afterwards, long term. Who do they want to be? So some people will go into the holidays thinking, I have to stick to my diet, I can't take a day off. And then other people will go in thinking, cheat day, I'm going to eat until it hurts. And there's some in between. I don't want to say there's none, but I was one of those people who was like, it was incredible, just these spreads of food. And I spent so much of my time dieting that I would go like, okay, I'll go in and I'll just eat in moderation. And then I would start eating and I felt like I couldn't stop. And so what I want to help people do now is we're practicing mindful eating all year round so that we can practice this more in those meals, to recognize that if we do eat a little bit more on that day, that's okay, that it's going to be up to the individual. So rather than saying, this is how you should eat on the holidays, is to ask them, well, how do you see this working into your long-term plan, not just for this one day, not just for this one year, but how do you want to eat on holidays? How do you want to feel? How does food fit into how you want to feel and who you want to be? And letting them come up with their own plan and saying, maybe they do say, you know what? I love the food. I never get to have a home cooked meal like this and be around all my family. And this is just such an important part of that I don't want to be thinking about food at all. Great. That's going to work for that person. If someone else says, I hate that feeling of being too full at the end of the meal, then we work on that. And then what we also do is after the meal, we see, did it work? Are you happy with how it went? Are you happy with how you feel? Is this how you want to do it again? Because someone might go in and say, I want to go in and eat all the food. And then they end up coming out and saying, oh, I really regretted that. I didn't want to be so full. I think I went overboard. So then we readjust for the next one.
Yeah, I love that. You got to give them the choice and they have to see what they want to get out of it. I try to really amplify this for clients and saying that, those foods are, if they're for enjoyment, it's an experience. What do you want to get from that experience? You want to taste everything? Then taste everything. Like, have a little bit of everything. And from there, it's going to be your choice as an individual. And I certainly think going in with a restricted mindset is super dangerous. I think, planning on being in a deficit, not that you can't, but it's super challenging over the holidays. If anything, over the holidays, it's like, what can we do to understand the right amount of food? Because this is when it's the most challenging for you to do it environmentally. Sometimes you just don't even want to say no, right? It's like, you don't want to try my pie, and it's like, okay, I'll try your pie, grandma. And it's more about enjoying that food culture. I think it's so relevant to individuals. And so I had a question in regard, because I know some people in nutrition will approach this differently for coaching. You're more on the emotional side and the psychological side. Do you still kind of educate your clients on calories and in the food types at all? Do you make them calorie aware, or concerned about calories? Because I know that's a pretty hot topic, because that gets into the nuanced details and makes people very uncomfortable.
It really depends on the person. I have some people that come in that just want to work on their relationship with food. Many of them have already done the calorie counting. They've already done the macro counting, and their relationships with food have devolved, and that's what they need to work on. I have other people who come in, work on their relationship with food, and then still want to achieve some weight loss. And so we'll look at what's going to work for them. Is tracking going to be more helpful or harmful? I lost the original question. What was the question?
It's just like how you're answering it right. It's just how much do you use kind of calories? Do you look at macros at all?
Right. So we do, for people, I usually do, if we're going to be working on anything beyond that, kind of emotional relationship with food, then we do start to talk about calories and things like that. We don't even necessarily have to track them, but I think it's really important for people to know about just some basic nutrition science. The what is a calorie? How many do my body, how much energy does my body need? What foods have, what different breakdowns of macronutrients? I think just having that basic basic information is really important for people to make more educated decisions about their food. Again, do we need to track, or for the people that have tracked, do we need to track long term? Not necessarily, but I definitely think that having some education is useful.
Yeah, I totally agree. And like you say, as soon as you said it, it made sense to me about they've probably done it. It's like if you've come from the dieting background, adding up calories comes pretty instinctive, but it's like the part that I have clients at either end where I'm not a calorie counter. It's like, I'm not even asking you to be a calorie counter. I'm asking you to be calorie aware and educate yourself. It's like, you might think that this meal is like too little or too much. And it can be at either end of the spectrum, right? There's people who push away from it and they're like, oh no, I don't really want to do this. And then we figure it out and they're like, oh, you are way under a deficit. Like, this is causing you issues and that's why you're not losing weight. And then at the other end, they're like, oh, if I just took these 3 foods out that are really just treat foods, I'd be in the deficit that I want to be in. So it gives people eye openers, right? And, like you say, just the fundamentals of it so people can have an understanding for what it's doing. And then it's building up that relationship. Now, with these clients, are you like, how do you track the progress? Or I guess, again, it would depend on the individual. Do you do body weight, feel, waist measurements, or anything like that? Body composition assessment in any way?
Yeah, if you nailed it. It really depends on the person. So if someone is, for the people that are working on their food relationships and body image, we stay away from those things. We usually take a nice long break from the scale and from body measurements and photos and things like that in order to work on that, to work on body image and things like that. In terms of measuring progress, though, what we do instead is to look at week to week. What are they noticing and what are they accomplishing? So I have them we have digital workbooks, and inside the digital workbook is something that I call a victory log. And so I'll have them fill that out usually on a weekly basis, to write down, what were their biggest victories. And so we actually spend, instead of looking at, what's happening, we don't really go in and check on a week to week basis, but we'll go in every couple of weeks and look at, what's happening. How am I responding differently to the stressors in my life or things like that? We'll look at where they are performing well in terms of their own standards and their own expectations. And then we adjust from there. For the people who are looking to lose weight, we do sometimes use the scale. It depends on the person. And sometimes I will even have someone just put so I had someone who I worked with for between 9 months to a year, just to stop binging. And then when we brought the scale back in, I said, switch it into kilograms, because she uses pounds. So switch into kilograms, take your weight once a week, send it to me, and don't keep track yourself. And so I was getting her weight in a number that meant nothing to her. And then eventually we switched back into pounds, and she has a healthy relationship with the scale now. We do sometimes use photographs. We do use sometimes body measurements. Very, very rarely will I have someone, weighing in daily. Usually, I think once a week is fine. But we try to keep the focus rather than on the numbers, in terms of, what can I control? Am I getting enough sleep? Am I making choices am I making food choices that I'm happy with? Am I pushing myself to exercise in a healthy way? So what are the things that are within my control, and how can I improve there?
Yeah, I love that kilogram idea. That is brilliant. I think that's because boxing was all in kilograms. I'm always doing the math on it, but I got used to it. But it's still like, you're right. It's like a number that doesn't mean anything to the person.
Most people have no idea.
No, because it's just awkward enough, because it's not just, it's 2.2, right? So it's like, it's like I could do that math, but then you're like, I don't know. What does that mean? It's like it's Spanish. And I love that. And so then you develop that relationship with the scale and you're able to improve it. I think that's really cool. And you mentioned exercise. That was gonna be my next question is, do you have exercise that you suggest? Do you have programs that you send them? And like just, or do you kind of like mainly focus on the food and it's their option?
A lot of the people that I work with have their own exercise routines that they're happy with. And I have CrossFitters, I have runners, I have power lifters, and I don't do so what we'll do is if they're having trouble, motivating themselves to work out, we'll work on that end of things, but I don't really suggest or prescribe anything. I would love to eventually pair up with someone who could do some programming for us, without so like I said, to pair up with a coach who would be able to work with our individuals. But for the most part, yeah, I let them do, find things that they like. And then we work on the mental aspect of sticking to and being consistent with that form of exercise that they choose.
Yeah, and it makes sense the way you say that because again, you're coming from people who are routine dieters, and so they've been doing probably some form of exercise to some degree, or just aware that exercise has to be a component. And I love how you say that. It's like, well, at the end of the day, it's still like it might be the motivation. That is where it is. Still falls within your scope, and you're going to help that. Why aren't you feeling like your exercise?
Mhm.
I find I transition my business to be about nutrition, exercise, and mindset, and I make sure people are very aware of that's what makes it the difference. Is like information is irrelevant without the right mind. We even spoke with this right at the start. It's like you heard the right thing at the right time and it made you reflect on your life and your practice different. And that's why the mindset piece is so critical. Information is useless without understanding how to implement the practice for you as an individual. And that's where coaching has its finesse. Is the coach's job to solve the problem with you and to express that information that reflects on you subjectively, right? So I think that's really
Mm.
cool. I have one interesting one here is like, if you're interested in expressing, what does your food look like? I know some of the viewers might be curious how an emotional eating coach has preferences or anything like that.
Yeah, it's funny. I don't get that question very often, but I would say the biggest thing for me is I eat very simply. And part of that comes from having counted macros for so long. I got used to seeing my meals in terms of like protein, carbs, and fat and veggies. Um, but yeah, so I've really just kind of settled into, I eat a couple meals a day. It's not always the same number of meals because it depends on how I'm feeling that day. It depends on whether I have a workout that day. But I eat a lot of, so typical meal for me would be like, in the morning, Greek yogurt with either some fruit or some oats, and for fats, either like nuts or seeds or cacao nibs. And I'll also do mostly egg whites. I'll throw a whole egg in there, have that with some fresh baked bread. Dinners, I am not in charge of. My partner loves to cook, and anytime I offer to cook, I get declined. So I eat whatever he makes. Usually, for carbs, we're on a big, like, we'll do a lot of like pierogies or gnocchi or things like that. Right now we're eating a lot of winter squash. So all kinds of squash. I'm kind of obsessed with pumpkins right now, just baking pumpkins and roasting the seeds. Oh my God. So I'm not, I'm also not, I know a lot of people that I do work with don't enjoy eating vegetables. I do, I don't love it. I don't go out of my way to eat them, but I do make a point to include them in, um, at the very least dinner, but I try to, have something with at least one of my other meals a day. The main thing is that I just I've gotten into these patterns with it where I'll just like I said, the way that I think about constructing my meal is, lean protein, carbs, fats. And then I don't really think about it too much.
Yeah, I like that, and it's really cool to hear this. How you don't think about it because you're used to it, but you develop the habits and the relationship with these foods where it's you look at it what it's doing for you, and that's what I try to really communicate to my clients is like the food has a purpose, right? And so what does it do for you? And it can be protein, it can be fats, it can be carbs, and it can be veggies just for micronutrients. And sometimes it's just goddamn enjoyable. So there's nothing wrong with that. Just know why you're having it, and that's how you can enjoy your diet, and it becomes a little bit more instinctual because we get this.
I will add, I do still eat dessert often. So I've actually gotten to the point where I used to just have it every night. I felt like my night was not complete without dessert, and I'll still have different desserts. We've got ice cream in the freezer. We've got, treats in the cabinet. But what I do now is that after dinner, I will monitor my fullness. And if I'm too full, I don't have the dessert.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's a right there. It's just like the term monitor, how you feel. Like just because it's a cultural norm is like, yeah. And I know that feeling of like, I'm not complete unless I have it. Just question that feeling sometimes is, habits are powerful, but habits can be broken, and you can recognize that emotion. I think that's really cool. And like you say, you even talk about pierogies, you talk about just making dishes, and, there's very much this clean eating movement or just the diet trends are about absolutions a lot, right? It's all the way from paleo. If it's not paleo, it's not right. If it's not keto, it's not right. And it's like, well, if we can just quantify food is how good it is for you depending on your goals and relative to you, like what's important to you. And so I really like hearing that because that shows that you've come a long way, like you say, from the clawing your way back into your own self. I think that's really cool. So just to wrap up here, I would love to know what Strong Ambition Podcast, what's your most recent ambition? What are you moving towards?
I'm just getting comfortable with saying this, but I am training for a marathon. And I avoided saying that for so long because I was like, oh my God, if I say it out loud, I actually have to do it.
That's how it starts. 100%. That's exactly what you have to do. And it's like you tell one person and it's starting to get real. You tell more than 3 people, I got to do this.
Now it's out there. Yeah. I'm aiming for a race in the spring.
That's awesome. Yeah. We were just talking about how you did your first half. And I think that's great. I think it's so important for people to have those discomforting challenges. And, I came from boxing, so that was heavy discomfort. But when I wasn't doing those things, I wasn't doing something that made me in some way nervous. I remember driving that day and telling my friend, I was like, this is the first time I felt nervous for something in a while. I needed this. Like, this was a really important thing to go through and to battle. So good on you. I think that's great. Like I told you before, it's just put in your time for the training and you'll be able to do it. It's just a matter of the mental will. I learned that, it's about, to me, it took just under 5 hours. So 5 hours is saying to yourself, I can, and one step after the other, as corny and as shitty as that sounds. But I honestly will say, I think any human can benefit from doing that practice. I think marathons, I think it's a good lifestyle. I think it's a terrible lifestyle, and I probably won't do one again, but I was super grateful I did it. So you'll be really appreciative of that goal. I think that's great. So thank you so much for joining me today. I'm certain I'm going to try to have you on again sometime. This was a lot of fun. I learned a lot. I know I'm going to send this to my clients so that they can learn some more. And we'll even try to incorporate some of these mental practices. And I love it. This was a really good talk. Thank you so much for joining today.
Yeah. And thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it.
Yeah, I'm glad. Okay. Well, have a good day, Alicia.
You too.
Thanks again to Alicia. That was a wonderful conversation. So much to learn when it comes to emotions. And just if you're looking for more information from Alicia, she has a Facebook group that anyone can join that is the Resilience Roundtable. And then there's also an email list that she has, and I will have links to that in the show notes. And I really recommend you reach out to her if you feel like you're someone who really gets challenged by emotions and eating. And if you know anyone that, this could benefit, please send this to them, because I think this is the message that we need to understand. It's our relationship with the foods, because we have a good idea of what the healthiest foods is, but why we're not eating more of that and we're eating more of the real tasty stuff has a lot to do with our emotions. So really good information there. And if you're looking for information from myself, remember to check out rqtrainingnutrition.com or my Instagram at rqtrainingnutrition. And thank you so much. Remember to like and subscribe. Most importantly, don't forget, it's not about the pursuit of happiness, but it's about the happiness within the pursuit.